Tonight what I'm going to go over is using the basic shaders in Unity in conjunction with Blender and UV unwrapping to create a glass texture. Now, there's a lot of limitations to the simple Unity shader or materials, and how it interacts with Blender is actually not always the best. In fact, in some ways it was a lot easier, but you know, well, we'll go through it and you'll probably see. So I have a Blender object here that I created, and it's pretty simple. And the way that it used to work with Blender is you used to be able to use a very simple shader. It wasn't you know, part of the cycles render or anything like that. You do transparency and mirroring, and that would kind of pop through, although I don't think the mirroring did. With the new versions of Blender, it's not quite as easy, and it requires some different playing with different things in Unity. In fact, really, in a lot of ways, if you've got an object like this, I just made like a cup, okay, and you want to make it glass. You just kind of throw a texture on there in Blender and you don't worry about it in any way, shape, or form. So really quickly as an intro, let's just take a look at the object. You can see I've unwrapped it. Probably could have put a seam along the top to get rid of some of this distortion. No big deal. So if I were to go in here, I've kind of set a glass, or I said a diffuse. I was changing it while I was talking. I set a glass here, you hit save, you go back into Unity, and guess what? If you put that in here, oops, I did not want to open it again, and you just drag it in here, nothing. So really, if you have a very simple glass material, here's how you want to kind of create a simple glass material, and that is, don't worry about any materials or textures in Blender. You're just going to come in here and you're going to right click and you're going to create your own new material. Now I like to keep materials with objects. So if you have a material that you're creating that's very specific for an object, I will keep it in the folder for that object. That's what I teach my students, and I want them to do that because it just kind of keeps everything contained, so it's just a lot easier. So I'm going to stay in that folder and I'm going to create a new material, and we'll just call it glass 1 because we're going to do this a couple of times, okay? And so now we have our new material, and if I click on that material and go into the inspector, you'll notice, by the way, I don't have any light maps. I haven't baked any lighting or anything like that, so this is basically really nice and simple. So I have my glass. Now, one of the things that's actually frustrating, back up here for a second, and that is if I click on my object, okay, and that if I go to my inspector, shouldn't have any thing, I can open this material here, and you notice you can't change anything, and I'm not quite sure why, but I think it's just because it wants to preserve the material as it has been in, or as it's made in Blender. So you have to make this new material. So that I was going to go over that first, but anyway, you have to make a new material. If you don't, then you can't alter that original material. So now we've got our glass 1 material. In fact, let me just rename it glass matte 1. Okay, and let's see, do I have, yeah, I have the glass in Blender. Let's close that for a second, and then I'm going to rename it just glass cup 1. Oops. Okay, just like that. So I have that, and that's the blend 1 file. We're just going to delete that to keep things simple. It'll pop back up again, but it'll have a different name. It'll say glass cup 1. So now we've got this glass cup, and I've got this glass material. So over here, I'm in a standard shader. That's all we're going to work on. There's a lot of other options that you can do, HDRP, that sort of stuff. I'm also going to turn off my camera here so that you can kind of see the previews better. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to take this rendering mode and you need to set it to transparent. We're working with a transparent object, and so you need to tell the renderer that you're working with a transparent material. Then you're going to take your albedo, and the first thing you want to do is go over here to your colors. You're going to click on that, and then you can take the alpha channel, which is right down here, and you can kind of set that to closer to 0. And the closer it is to 0, the more transparent the object is, and you can kind of see it went a little darker. We're also going to change our color a little bit, but let's wait on that for a moment. The first thing let's do is, now that we've kind of got this set, I always like to see it in real time in the environment. So I'm going to take this glass material and I'm going to drag it up onto my object. And that's going to take that object and it's going to replace the shader that was on there with a shader that you're creating now, or this material that you're creating now, I should say. Now, if you're going to do that, a couple of quick words about that. Once I drag this cup back out here, then it's going to keep their original material. So it's one of those kind of weird things about Unity, which I kind of like in this case. It's trying to preserve the materials that are in the Blender file, and so it's not going to replace them. So one of the things that I recommend is making a prefab. So we're going to take our glass cup and we're going to create a prefab variant from that cup, and then I'll just I'll call it cup 1 prefab. Okay, so now I can go in here, double click, go into what I call the isolation mode. I guess it's an Adobe thing, and I can drag that out there. Now let's go back into our scene. Then I'll drag the prefab out into the scene, and now when I take care of this, I can make changes, and those changes I can then bounce back onto the prefab, essentially, or apply or override back to the prefab, and then it's going to have those changes will be available for every instance of that prefab that I create later. But that's a little bit of a different thing. So anyway, we've got this. Now, a couple of things. You basically you don't have all that much control over glass in these really simple in the standard shaders. And so really you have to worry about your metallic and your smoothness. It's really what you're dealing with. So if you want higher reflections, then you increase the metallic. But the problem with that is as you increase the metallic, then what ends up happening is you lose transparency. So you want the metallic higher and then the smoothness all the way high. And what that'll do is that's going to kind of create this kind of a shaded look. And you'll notice that the lower the metallic slider is, then you can't quite see through, or you can see through the glass a lot better, and it loses a little bit of its tone. You can also kind of change that a little bit with this albedo. You can kind of change the tone of the glass with the albedo. You can also give it a little bit of a color. You can do a lot of different things with it here. And that's going to just change how reflective it is too, so that if I bring it a little closer to my object here, theoretically you should be able to see it. But you're not going to see it because we don't have a reflection probe on it, which is what we're going to deal with in a second. So anyway, if you just want it simple like that, then there you go. Now, in order to get this to really work, what we also have to do is we have to add ourselves a reflection probe. So we're going to go to Game Object, we're going to go under the Lighting menu, and we're going to Reflection Probe. And a reflection probe is exactly kind of what it sounds like. It's a probe that essentially works on kind of giving us a sense of reflections. Now we have this reflection probe here. Depending upon what you're doing, I suppose you could add it to the prefab. I'm not sure what that's going to do. So I'm going to switch it to real time, and immediately you notice some major differences with the probe. I don't have it quite set up in the right place here. There we go. So now what you're seeing is you're getting some blue reflections here on the reflection probe that's kind of reflecting the sky. And you can also kind of see a preview on the reflection probe itself. And that's already starting to look just so much better, so very much better. Let's see, real time. You can also edit the bounding volume here. So if you kind of click on this, which you can kind of see is the bounding volume, you can raise it up, give it a little bit more of an extension. so that it's a little bit more centered. So like this object's going to be on the ground. I don't ever really have to worry about it doing too much there. And it will essentially see everything that is around it in a nice way. So you can just kind of see how the reflection is kind of working with the highlights of the glass. So that makes it look immediately a lot better. And you can add that to your prefab. And so now whenever you drag one of these glasses out, it's going to have, it should have, oh, it doesn't because I didn't copy it. So once you do this, you have to click the overrides, and I'm going to, oh, it says there's no overrides. Well, now that's interesting. I guess the reflection probe is scene based only. I'm learning something new here. Let's try something here. I'm going to go into the prefab. And let's add our own reflection probe here in the, So now let's go back out in the scene. And it has a reflection probe. And, okay, so yeah, so now we can set that to real time. And now, if I go back to the prefab, overrides, now I can start to and apply any changes that I made, so that if I add a new glass cup prefab, it's going to come with the exact same reflection probe attached to it. So there you go. It's kind of interesting that you can't just drag it and then hit the override and add the reflection probe, but that's starting to look, pretty good. You can see there's a little bit of distortion happening because of the facets and the faces that are in the object, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of other things that you can do, including adding normals map, like a normals map that will create a little distortion to it. Just for instance, I could add just one of these normals maps that's already there. That's not really going to be great, but we'll just do a glass kind of a thing, and that's kind of cool. So I added a normals map, and you can kind of see how it warps and reflects the glass in a nice manner. And again, this is something that you really can't do in Blender with this object. So really the lesson here is that once you start creating a glass object in Blender, you can only do so much. You just create the object, but then after a certain point you can't do much more. But let's just say, for instance, what if I wanted a glass object that had like text on it or something like that? Now things start to get really, really complicated. So what I'm going to do here is let's go to our glass cup, and I'm going to open it back up in Blender, and let's create a new version of this. So I'm just going to say File, Save As, and I'm going to call it Glass Cup number 2. And then if I go to my UV, you can see I've got my UV all set. So let's export our UV layout here. And we're just going to put it, make sure it's in the same folder. Yep, the right folder. I always like to go a little higher on my textures. Sometimes I even do 4096 just to kind of go a little higher, and then I can always res down, but it's harder to res up, right? Actually, it's there. Theoretically, you shouldn't. And then I'll just call this Glass Cup 2 UV export. Okay, so now I have that. And then what I'm going to do is let's go back to Unity, and you'll see that UV export comes up here. I'm going to open this up in Explorer, and we've got our UV export. And what I'm going to do is let's right click, and I'm going to open it in either Photoshop or GIMP. I'm going to use GIMP because I'm trying to use free software for these tutorials as much as possible, just because they're accessible to everyone. So I like for people to be able to see that and to use the free software if they can. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a piece of text on here. So I'll just go to my text tool. I'm going to click on here, and we'll just type in text nice and big, and let's, I gotta highlight it, and let's just make it nice and big. So that's pretty good, like that. And let's create a nice, let's do like a bright blue color. How about that? And now we can kind of put this here, and we can rotate it. So let's go to our rotate tool, and I can rotate it 90 degrees with the shift key held down. Go to my move tool. I'm not good enough in GIMP to like know all the keystrokes and stuff like that, so all y'all are sitting there going, oh, you should be doing this, should be doing that. Like, yeah, sorry. Okay, so now we have this just blue text sitting there, and let's just save this as a GIMP file really quickly. And then what I'll do is I'll turn off the UV export, and let's export as, and I'm just going to call this cup 2, and I'll call it texture. Oops, I caps lock on somehow. Hit that button. Okay, so now I have that, and I've exported it. And let's go back into Blender. So in the Blender, to take that PNG and put it on top of my cup, I'm going to go to my shader here. I'm going to change this material from a glass BSDF to your principled BSDF. And then I'm going to hit Shift A, or go to the Add menu, and I'm going to say Image, or Texture, and then Image Texture. Grab this, connect my color to the base color, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to grab that texture PNG. So now, not seeing anything, right? But if I go to my material, there's my text on the outside of my nice glass cylinder. So I've got this text here, but it's not transparent. The cool thing is that you can do that. So we're going to take this, and I'm going to take my alpha, and I'm going to drag it down to the alpha on the principled BSDF. And now right here, the material shader, the material preview shader kind of fails. It doesn't show me my transparency. The only way to really do this is to make sure that you go to the render properties and you set cycles. Make sure you set it to GPU if you've got a GPU. If you're working on a laptop that doesn't, then you don't have that. And what you're going to do then is you're just going to change the viewport shader to texture. Now, I don't have any lights. I've deleted the lights, the cameras, and everything from the Blender file, but I can see that it is transparent, so that's good. So now we're just going to hit Save, and let's go back to Unity, and it's going to bring this cup back in here. So we'll leave this one back where we're at. So we're just going to take this and we'll bring this over here, kind of get it out of the way. And then we're going to take our cup 2 and we're going to do the exact same thing. So I've got my blend file here. I'm going to create a new prefab. And we're going to call this cup 2 prefab. Okay. And now I can go into my prefab, and we can start to edit. So now I've got this. We can add ourselves a reflection probe. Okay, bring that up. Okay, just like that. And you can hit the edit button, and you can kind of bring this up to where you want it to be. So probably bring it right to the bottom a little bit. And then actually probably just take the whole reflection probe, let's bring it down. I probably just like it right in the center so that it's not messing up the center of the object like it did before. And then we'll go back here and increase our reflection envelope here. That's probably good enough for what we're doing here. Okay. So we've got that, but we still have this problem where it's not a transparent material. Let's change this to real time, and you see that very little happens here to my cylinder. And the reason for it is this is not a transparent material. If you take a look, it's a standard opaque shader. So I'm going to have to go back in here and create another material. Again, I'm just keeping it in the same folder. And we'll call this whoops, I hit caps lock again. Glass cup. or we'll call it glass material 2, just like that. Okay, so now we have this glass material 2, and we're going to do the exact same thing. So I'll just take this and drag it onto my object here, and then we're going to take it and we're going to set it to transparent. And then I can take the metallic up a little bit, click on my albedo, I could set the transparency down and set the smoothness up, and you can kind of see how the reflection's working. But now what I can do is I can set another albedo. Now I found that if I take, let's just try this, so if I take my glass cup 2 texture, put it in here, look at that. So you have this secondary mapping place where you can set your text and you can kind of see what it's going to look like. So let's get out of the scene here and we can start to edit this. So let's just drag our glass cup 2 prefab right out onto the scene and bring it up. And you can kind of see what's going on here with it. Now I can open the shader up and let's take a look. What happens if I take the alpha up? Now we can see the text a lot better. Whoops. Can't see the text a lot better at all. So the albedo here, see, it affects, this alpha here affects both of them. And that's what's kind of frustrating a little bit by this. So if I have the albedo up, then it's opaque. We can see the text a little bit better. It's actually in the middle is where we see the text best. So what I would probably do is let's go here and just say none on this albedo on the secondary map. And then I drag my glass cup 2 texture into the albedo on the main map. And now things start happening in a way that we probably anticipated a little bit better. I can still adjust my alpha on this top albedo to make the text either fully opaque or not partially opaque. And what's cool about this is now the clear portions of the PNG are now going to be allowing the light to come through. Now, couple of quick things about that. If you're new to PNGs and JPEGs and all this other stuff, don't ever save your texture as a JPEG, because JPEGs do not support transparency, and what we're doing is we're using the transparent area of the image that we've set in GIMP. So that's what this checkerboard here means in GIMP. That checkerboard basically means that there's no color here. Sometimes it's helpful to even think about the fact that even white is an opaque color. I think a lot of times when we think about textures and colors, we kind of get stuck in that idea that paper white it's almost like drawing. That paper white means you didn't put any graphite down on the paper, so it's clear. But in digital terms, it's not. In digital terms, white is a color too, and white can be opaque as well. So that's actually really important to understand, is that white can actually be a color. So let's go back here to Unity, and you'll see that I can, again, just like I was before, I can kind of start playing with the texture and the metallic ness of it to kind of increase or decrease my reflections. Again, the higher the metallic content, the less transparent it is. The lower the metallic slider, then you have less reflections. Okay, so somewhere in the middle, or not even close to the middle, somewhere in here is pretty good. You also can adjust this a little bit, or you can try to adjust the albedo here, right? But it doesn't do anything. And the reason why it doesn't do anything is because you're telling it to replace these colors here with this texture that you have, where the PNG is actually perfectly clear. So if you want to add a little bit of color albedo, like we did to this glass here, where we set it at about 10%, you have to do that in GIMP. So if I go back to GIMP here, what I can do is I'll just take and I will make a new layer. I'm a little rusty in GIMP. Okay, I'm going to make a new layer. We'll call this albedo shade. Okay, and for right now, we'll just set it fill with transparency. We're just going to set it with the background color, which is black. Okay, just like that. And then what I can do is I can take the opacity of this layer here and I can slide it way down. And so it was about 10% on the before, so I can set it to about 10% then. 11.6, it's probably fine. And then what I'll do is, let's save. And then one of the things I love about GIMP is if you haven't closed it, it'll export right over top of your original or your other PNG. And now you can see that it did change the darkness a little bit and made it kind of more akin to that. Let's take that normals map that we had and let's add that normals map back in. So that was which one was it? There's my cellular normals map. There we go. So we're kind of doing a very similar thing here as we did with the other glass. It still isn't quite the same, and I think part of that is because the metallic is a little bit high, so it's 0.062. So if I click here, yeah, 0.062. And it's 11% on the gray scale there. But again, if I wanted to add a little bit of tone to this, I could do that. Again, I would need to go back to GIMP. So I might let's call this Albedo shade, and we'll call it black. Okay, and I can turn that off and create another new one. And whoops, hit cancel for a second. Let's do our foreground color. Let's make like a red shade. So let's click OK. So now we've got that red as a foreground color. And I'll make a new one, and I'll call this red. And then we go foreground color here, like that. Click OK. And then again, we can take that transparency way down to create kind of a red color. Save, and then export back over top of the original. Go right back into Unity, and ta-da, we now have a nice red glass with blue text. But couple of things that are really a pain in the butt. The first thing you'll notice is if I get out of this, you'll notice that you don't see the text through the other side of the glass. Whereas in Blender, you would see that. So let's go back to Blender here. And if I go here, you can see the text on through the back side of the glass. So a lot of this is just due to we're using our standard shader in Unity, and it doesn't have a lot of the it doesn't do ray tracing, it doesn't have a lot of those calculations that you might expect. So it does have some limitations to it. You could figure something out. So for instance, what you could do, and I'm not saying that this is going to look amazing, is I could go into GIMP, we'll turn this back on, I'll take my text. Can I alt drag in text? Can you alt drag? No. So I'll just duplicate the layer. Bring this like so. And then go to our rotate tool. Oh, actually, we don't want to rotate it. We do need to rotate it. We need to rotate it, and we need to flip it horizontal. And then we go to layer and transform and flip vertical. Actually, it's horizontal. That doesn't work. That's weird. Flip horizontally, I guess then. Yeah, that should work. So now it's going to be backwards. So again, I'll save. Then again, I'll export back over top. Now, it may not be aligned top to bottom very well. You just have to kind of do this little by little. But now you can see that the text is there, and the text is also there. Problem being, I had turned on the lines so to line it up. So we'll hit save and re-export again. There we go. Go back, and now you can kind of see like that's a little bit of a. It's definitely a hack, but it works, right? So basically, yeah, that's essentially it. One of the other things that's interesting about this is you can't click on the object. Like this object here, I can't click on it unless I click on the text. Like I can't select it unless I select the text, which is really kind of weird. But it works. It works, I guess. You just got to remember that because it doesn't like selecting where there's no transparency. So, I was able actually to click on the edge, just not in the middle, I guess. I don't know. Now it's working, and it wasn't just before. You saw that, right? I'm not crazy. So anyhow, that's essentially how you do that. There's a lot more that you can play with, but in reality, again, with this simple shader, the standard shader, you're not going to be able to do too much. So, to review, just so that we're kind of on the same page. 1, transparency in alpha basically doesn't come through from Blender to Unity unless you're using a transparent PNG as a UV unwrap texture. But even then, you still have to create a new material in Unity. And that's the biggest trick of this whole thing, is in order to get a glass texture, you have to create a new material from scratch, drag your PNG into it or whatever you need to do, and then you need to replace the texture that's coming in from Blender with your new material onto the object. Also in review, if you have multiple instances of that same object in your scene, then you need to create a prefab variant so that you can make those edits to the prefab variant. Because if you don't do that, then you'll have to drag your texture or your material to the object in the scene every time you put one in, which isn't a big deal. But of course, if you multiply that by a whole bunch of objects, that can actually be a pretty annoying method of doing stuff. When you're working with transparent or glass textures, remember your rendering mode needs to be set to transparent. Your metallic slider adjusts how much reflection there is, and your smoothness also kind of adjusts the amount of reflection as well. You need to have the smoothness pretty much all the way up and the metallic down as low as you possibly can in order to still gain those reflections but also be transparent. If you slide the metallic slider up, then it loses the transparency. And lastly, you need a reflection probe. That reflection probe needs to be in the scene with the object. When I've been doing or researching things on the internet, most of the time I see the reflection probes are not attached to the object and in the prefab variant, but it seems to work. But I haven't actually populated a whole huge game level with a bunch of glass objects with reflection probes attached to them, so take that one with a grain of salt. The other thing that you want to be mindful of is with your prefabs, I had their reflection probes set to real time. Depending on your processing cycles and all that sort of stuff, you might want to set them on real time as you're adjusting things, but then don't forget to set them back to baked in the prefab itself. So go into isolation mode. You can click on your reflection probe here and set it back to baked when you're ready to bake your lighting for the whole scene. And again, that just depends on the lighting and what you're doing with your scene, and I'm not going to go into all the particulars there. But don't forget that if you set it on real time, that you might want to back that off a little bit later once you're ready. So yeah, so that's basically it. That's a quick tutorial, not all that quick, I guess, but quick enough on different methods of using the standard shader to create glass textures with and without text. Using PNG or not using a PNG, and hopefully you found it helpful. If it did help you, click the like button. If I did something completely wrong or could have improved upon my textures, I'm sure there's lots of things that I don't know about this. Let me know in the comments below. And please, above all else, click the subscribe button, and I appreciate it. Have a good night.